Hello and welcome to the Shepheard-Walwyn podcast series. My name is Jonathan Brown. Shepheard-Walwyn is a campaigning book publisher based in London, England. Our purpose is to uncover and promote new ideas to society's oldest problems. And whilst our specialty is ethical economics, something Anthony Werner, our driving force for over 40 years, has pioneered, we have branched out over the years to other related areas such as the environment and the lives and works of society's change agents. These podcasts promote ideas we're convinced can actually help us build a better society for all of us. So have a listen and be sure to share with your friends if you like them, but also tell us what you think. These are debates we all need to be part of. So without further ado, let's get into the interview. Today we continue our mini-series with Edi Bilimoria, author of the stunning 4-volume work Unfolding Consciousness. Now, as Book 4 is a reference book for the series, this is the penultimate dialogue with Edi. Book 3, entitled Gazing Through the Telescope, Man is the Measure of All Things, has a lot of ideas, so we felt it was best to split the conversation into two. In this part, we look at the first half of Book 3. We've done our best to make this audio friendly. However, I do encourage you to watch this on YouTube if you can, or at least check out the diagrams in the video when you've listened to it. They made a massive difference to my understanding, and our feedback from listeners and readers suggests that they could help you too. Now we jump straight into this conversation with Edi explaining what is consciousness and why we need to focus more on relationships than on things. So let's get into the interview.
Mention it to most people and they say, how do you define consciousness? Now, a definition always depends on something else that needs to be defined, and that depends on something else. Now, if someone said to me, define consciousness, I would say to them, look, you've come to see me. Where did you come from? Wherever. Say you came from New York or Cairo or Bombay. It was a journey. Can you define your journey? No. You've experienced your journey. Can you define it? The experience is the inner subjective live moment that you can bring up in your mind. You can describe your journey, but you can't define it. You can describe it because you can put the inner subjective into an outward objective conceptual framework in words, but the description is not the described. So it's a problem with the scientific communities in general, is they want definitions. Experience they're very uncomfortable with.
And you know, Edi, when I was going through the preparation for this work, I came across the machinery metaphor, or a mechanism metaphor. And it struck me that what so-called scientists say about machines tells me that they have no long-term relationship with a machine. Because and here's why, right? Because
I'd like to hear that.
My family is in engineering and mechanics, right? I've got a history. My family has a history of engineering and mechanics, so very much hands-on in a machine. And when you listen to an expert mechanic talk about the machine or the car or the digger or anything else, they do not see it as a group of parts. They actually see it as an entity, and
as a mechanically living entity.
And they recognize, and they talk about a machine as it has a personality. Now, it's not to say that it does have a personality, that they are actually living entities, but there's something about the relationship of the parts that goes beyond the parts itself. And if you have an old car that hasn't been taken care of, you will know this, because if you change one part, that changes every relationship, and then everything starts to fall apart, doesn't it? Because it's like now you've got this brand new part in relation to all the other old parts, and that now puts a strain on everything else because the relationships have now changed. And I'm just thinking the problem isn't, the problem is inexperience of all things. And if you actually bring it back to your experience of something, that then is a thing. And I came across I got a phrase there. It's like, I thought a noun is merely a slow moving verb. Do you know? And I was listening to Ian's one of Ian's talks in his The Matter with Things, and I think one of the things he said is he wanted to say there's no such thing as things, and it's everything's in process. Everything, the journey is not a noun; it's a journeying, right? And it's what you're saying is, how do you define which part of the journey do you want me to define? Because I can maybe do that. I can describe it, but actually, as soon as I've described it, you've moved on to the next part of that journey from New York to London, right?
Yes. So what you've said, that in a sense, everything has a soul. Even an old car has a mechanical soul, so to speak. But when you talk about description, once you've described, it's moved on. There's an old saying that the tree you described is never the same tree because it's moved on, it's grown. And so we like to say everything is in a state of being and becoming. Being, if you like, the noun, and becoming the verb associated with it. Yes.
Well, what a great way to start our conversation, Eddie. And we're here, and just to do the official pitch, rather than jumping into this amazing work that you produced, we're here to explore Volume 3, which is officially that, I guess, kind of the final volume of the 4-volume series, because Volume 4 is a reference for the whole thing. And it was very excited to carry on the conversation. Now, in the preamble to Book 3, if it's okay for us to get into straight away.
Sure.
So in the preamble, you describe it as man, a miniature universe, a mirror of cosmos.
Yes.
So, starting with that, why do you say that man mirrors the cosmos and is a miniature universe?
I say that because there is one overall process that brings things about, whether it's on the cosmic scale or on the human scale, whether it's to do with the macrocosm or to do with the microcosm. So in the same way as the whole of man, and by man we don't mean the male gender, of course, we mean the thinking entity. Just as man displays essentially two primary aspects of the mortal and the immortal, which one can unpack into body, soul, and spirit, soul being the intermediate, the interface between spirit and body. Similarly, the universe, the cosmos, displays the archetype, the intellectual and the sensible, the spiritual aspect, the intellectual aspect, I mean the mind quality, and the sensible being the material aspect. So by studying these aspects in man, one can understand the greater picture, the macrocosm, by invoking the wonderful hermetic axiom, as above, so below. And in fact, in Volume 1, I have a very simplistic diagram showing how human birth mirrors cosmic birth. By cosmic birth, I mean, I'm not talking about the overall Big Bang, about the evolution of, let's say, a solar system.
Are you able to give an example of that?
Well, the human womb, so to speak, and the womb of the cosmos is the anima mundi in many ways, that which has been the precursor of all the forms that are to develop. The lifeblood of the human being is the blood fed from mother to child, obviously by the umbilical cord. The lifeblood of the universe is what Newton alluded to as a subtle spirit, and in many ways the pranic reservoir.
Amazing. Now, so one of the things that you're stretching right now is my ability to perceive and to understand what you're saying, and in the preamble you focus very much on that, and quoting T.S. Eliot, which was just the most amazing lines of knowledge of speech but not of silence, knowledge of words and ignorance of the word. All our knowledge brings us nearer to death, but nearness to death no nearer to God. What is it that causes you to place such an emphasis on our sensitivity of the instruments of perception and of our physical senses?
Yesterday I was listening to a short interview with Steven Pinker, the psychologist and author. He was going on and on about being rational and evidence. What causes me to place such emphasis on the sensitivity of the instruments of perception is that you only see what you are capable of seeing. So as William Blake said, Eliot of course, but if the doors of perception were, how did he put it, cleansed, everything would appear as it really is. So if your spectacles now were fogged, you would have a very different perception of the world around you. So the sensitivity of your instruments of perception, of your physical instruments and high instruments, is of the utmost importance. Plotinus mentioned that. St. Paul mentioned, did he not, that if we see through the eyes of flesh, we will see things of the flesh, which is fine. But if you want to see things of the spirit, then your eyes have got to be more refined to see things of the spirit. A piano, a violin, any musical instrument will only play as good a tune as it is sensitively capable of doing so by virtue of its tuning and its construction. So I would say to scientists that yes, evidence, but you never ask who is the person capable of seeing this evidence, or experiencing this evidence. If I showed any person, ordinary man, an experiment to do with colors, well, he would see colors, blue, green, pink, and all the rest of it. If I showed the same experiment to, say, Isaac Newton, he would see a whole spectrum of possibilities. He's looking at the same thing, but because his instruments of perception are far more finely tuned, he will see far more into it than a person with, opaque instruments.
And this is, I know, if we remind our listeners and our viewers just that at the very start of your work, you talk about the importance of their experience, and everything in many respects comes back to that. And it's our challenge to become more and more refined in our ways of sensing. Which I guess is and that for me is it's a wonderful encapsulation of obviously the five senses, but by sensing there's something in my own view, is there something bigger than that, and I think that's what you're getting into, isn't it? In the a new way of knowing, which is KNEW way of
deliberately,
and the new way of looking. So what are the new ways of knowing?
Well, you can break them into three ways, all of which have their relevance. The first is looking through the world of the senses, which is fine, but then all you will have is what you see in front of you, and you will be essentially ignorant about the higher purpose behind things. The second way, which is the most problematic, is learning the way of learning. But the trouble with learning is it's a two-edged sword. There's the beautiful saying, you will experience and learn the blossoms of life, but under every flower a serpent coiled. So this is, so to speak, the way of probation, where you do learn things, but you also learn to taste not only sweet fruit, but bitter fruit. And having necessarily been through that period of probation, then there is the final learning, which is omniscience, wisdom, completely having put aside all ego and all personal self-indulgence, because we've learned that under every flower a serpent is coiled. So don't tarry, don't linger and get engrossed in the perfume of that flower in case the serpent gets you. Move on from there to higher vistas of learning.
What a wonderful way of starting the conversation. Yes. So with that in mind, of the importance of our focusing on our own journey to wisdom, or, in chapter 1 you talk about the symbolism and the language of the mystery teachings. Why is symbolism so important to an understanding of the inner realms of existence?
It is absolutely vital, because ordinary language is wedded to a linear and intellectual mode of thought, which is, of course, very well suited to conveying precise information, and it's vital for that. You don't use symbolism to describe how you change the piston rings in your car. It's precise and literal. But objective facts and scientific theories are all very well, but they are a poor medium for conveying the subjective and multi-layered realms of experience and the deep truths that are necessarily beyond words and above left brain thinking. So that is why the scriptures that recourse to parable, to allegories, to metaphor, and above all to symbols, because a symbol unlocks meaning at different levels. And there is a saying that symbolism is the pictorial expression of an idea or a thought. Now, a symbol is not an icon. For example, a traffic light is an icon. It's not a symbol. It has a definite meaning. Red means stop, green means go. Orange, well, there's a bit of ambiguity there. You can either stop or go forward. But an icon, as on your computer, has a fixed meaning. A symbol can be taken at varying levels.
And some of the you have a number of symbols in the book.
Labyrinth and the forest.
And you've got the labyrinth, the forest. Some of the things that stand out: the labyrinth, the forest, and also tarot cards as well.
I've got. Can I share a picture of the tarot cards? Would this be appropriate now?
Yeah, sure.
You sure? Okay, so if I share screen, I've singled out 3 of the tarot cards that I felt were most useful for our conversation. The first one is called the Hermit, and as you can see, it says concealing the light of wisdom. Now, what's it showing? It's showing an aged man leaning on a staff. He carries a lamp that's partly concealed within his cloak. Now, the aged man, the hermit, is the wisdom seeker. It also represents the secret organizations that explore wisdom. The staff, the yellow-green staff in his hand, is man's enduring support, his mind. And the cloak, of course, is man's bodies. And the lamp is Atma, the spiritual light, whose light in the average person is greatly dimmed by having to shine through the cloak. But one can still see the light through the cracks in the cloak. But when the man attains wisdom, the light shines fully and brightly. The third one, and I'll come to the lovers the second, the third one is called the judgment, which is liberating the spiritual nature. And here we see three figures rising from a coffin or a sepulchre. Now, the three figures represent the immortal triad of Atma, Buddhi, and Manas, the divine self, the intuitional principle, and the higher mind. And of course, the sepulchre, the coffin, is the mortal personality. And when the mortal personality, when we slough our mortal coil, we liberate these three beings, the three figures that you see. Now, the lovers is the most relevant, I feel, to most people, most of us. We see in the middle a youth flanked by two maidens, and both maidens love him. This is very important. They both love him. One maiden, one on the left, is called vice. The one on the right is called virtue. But the youth must choose which one he will love. And as I said, both of them love him. Your virtues and your vices both love you, but you have to choose. And so what this card shows us is the price of free will. The price of free will, of choice, is responsibility. The price of free will or choice is responsibility. And just developing this theme, in the next slide, we see Plato's teaching on the double nature of the mind principle, exactly what I said. The problem of good and evil. Why do I do something my conscience says I shouldn't do? That's the vice bit. But why sometimes do I act virtuously? That's the virtue bit. And here we see the tarot card represented in terms of Plato's wonderful teaching that psyche, the soul, is a generic term, and soul can rise to ally with nous, the spiritual soul, so to speak, and attain immortality. Or psyche can choose to descend and attach itself to anoia, the folly, the irrational animal soul. And we can correlate this teaching of Plato with the tarot cards. Here we are. So I'm going to stop sharing now, Jonathan, and if you want, I can talk about the labyrinth and the forest very quickly, if you like.
Yes, please. I know, and in your book, there's two types of labyrinth as well. So if you can,
yes, that's very important.
Take us through that.
The multicursal and the unicursal. But before that, let's stop sharing. So the forest is a fairly obvious one, where you're lost in the thick of the forest through the trees and the woods, and you can only find your way out by using all your intelligence and all your powers of discernment and perception, and most of all, keeping calm. So the forest is, of course, a well-known symbol for the confusion of the average state of mind, but also pointing that there is a way through the forest if we follow the clues. If you see a path if you hear some animal sounds that you recognize and can take that as a lead. Now, the labyrinth is fascinating. The multicursal labyrinth means you are faced with a multiple choice of paths, and you really are lost. You don't know which path to take. And the Hampton Court maze is an example of that. The unicursal labyrinth is essentially a spiral that, even though it winds round and round and goes all over the place, there is essentially one direction that leads to the center. Now, the interesting thing is the Cretan labyrinth at Knossos in the legend was a multicursal labyrinth. You entered, and if you didn't get devoured by the Minotaur, you got lost. But on the Cretan pottery, we see that the labyrinth is not multicursal, but unicursal. And it makes this point that we enter life and we find everything is, well, a bit like a maze. But through learning, through bitter experience, through joyful experience, and through wisdom, we transform our personal multicursal labyrinth into a unicursal labyrinth. So we have finally found a way through the labyrinth. And even though initially we were faced with a multiple choice of paths, we now have sufficient focus and understanding to see where we are going, even though it may take us all over the place and up and down.
Brilliant, thank you. I know in this chapter also you talk about how symbols can get distorted. And one of the examples of that is animal sacrifice.
Yes, a very good point you raised. It's not only symbols, Jonathan, it's anything that starts off in its purity, gets distorted, gets polluted, and gets taken literally. And here the problem is taking things literally. Now, the animals that were typically sacrificed, were bulls and rams, and also humans by the pagans. And when the perennial wisdom degenerated in the hands, or the wisdom never degenerates, but it was degenerated by people who did not understand it, and they didn't realize that the sacrificing of the bull and the ram does not mean the sacrificing of a poor creature. It means the sacrificing of the bull nature within the person. Now, what does the bull signify? Earthiness, truculence, impulse, and bull's a lovely creature, of course, but the bull nature in a person signifies this earthiness, this quality of obstinacy, smashing things down, going all over the place. So it was the bull nature that had to be burned in the fire, not the poor actual bull. And this is where animal sacrifice took on, a ghastly aspect.
I know you mentioned how the idea of sacrifice is an example of the deterioration of a society, not the essence of what made a society great. Whether you talk about the Mayan cultures, the Incas, and the Aztecs, and even the Hawaiians as well, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So we continue this theme then of symbolism and symbolic representations into chapter 2, when we look at the unity of the cosmos, nature, and man. And you make the controversial statement that astrology is a royal science and not a pseudoscience, as I think most engineers and scientists would argue, or even they wouldn't even argue.
Yeah,
there's a knowing that astrology is meaningless and it's only for foolish people, to be polite about people who believe in astrology. So firstly, maybe it's helpful to say, right, pseudoscience, what is that? And then why is astrology not only not a pseudoscience, but actually a royal science?
Let me say, Jonathan, that when I was working for my PhD, I did a full course on astrology. And the only way to find things out is to learn about it and not accept some of the nonsense that people talk about it. But what is a pseudoscience? A pseudoscience is something that appears to be scientific, but is not. It wears a mask of science rather than being science itself. So pseudoscience is a pretended or spurious science. Now, those who rubbish astrology are not entirely wrong if they base their opinions on newspaper astrology, on the columns of popular newspapers, without bothering to dig deeper, as genuine scientists ought to do. But what are they missing? If astrology endeavored to explain the dynamics of general relativity and obviously totally floundered, astrology would not just be a pseudoscience, it would be a rubbish science. Equally, when physical science tries to understand planetary influences and correlations through a purely materialistic lens, then it too flounders. Physical science, in fact, becomes a pseudoscience because it pretends to know what it does not know, and so it assumes a mask of science. So there is a knowledge and a knowing that can be derived by means that are not amenable to physical science. And that knowledge, central to astrology, is transcendental metaphysics, dealing with the greatest and the most abstruse problems concerning the universe and man, which is a far cry from pure materialism. So science or pseudoscience depends not just on the subject, but it depends crucially on the context of that subject. I would go so far as to say that materialism per se, when it tries to explain consciousness, materialistic science is a pseudoscience because it wears a mask of science. It does not dig deeper and try to understand what lies beyond and above materialistic science. Some of the greatest scientists and mystics and philosophers were astrologers. Isaac Newton famously, though he didn't talk about it for obvious reasons, Johannes Kepler, Carl Jung, and many others. So astrology concerns the science of soul, not the science of body. And the medical side of astrology is fascinating. There are very interesting correlations between planetary configurations and the propensity for human disease. Mikhail Gauquelin was a very famous French statistician who set out to disprove astrology, but working in the true spirit of science, he was completely convinced, and he wrote a fascinating book showing how great sportsmen, great scientists, and great artists have certain planetary configurations which are statistically demonstrable, way, way beyond any charge of chance and coincidence and all that. So again, I say to scientists who rubbish astrology, first, you must study in order to learn. You must learn in order to understand. You must understand in order to judge. Is that a bit heavy?
No, it's fantastic. It was,
Can I give you the quick example of Barrett? I think it was Barrett who was giving a lecture on telepathy, at a scientific conference, and Sir William Barrett, that is, yeah. And one of his colleagues came up to him afterwards and says, that was a great lecture, but it's all tosh. It's all tosh. And Barrett very calmly said, you are a scientist. When you have spent as many weeks as I've spent years researching these things, I will value your opinion. And his colleague very valiantly said, yes, you are right. I have no right to my opinion without researching it. And I believe he then was quite convinced about telepathy on the basis of his own research.
Well, no, I mean, when I study the laws of influence, there's a guy called Robert Cialdini, who's the most quoted social scientist in the world, I think, still. And he talks about the way in which, as rules of thumb. So, for example, the idea that if you pay more for something, it tends to be better quality.
Mm.
So a way in which you can get tricked into buying something that's rubbish is actually if it's higher price than a normal option. I think, normally, and as a rule of thumb, that's accurate. And I think as a rule of thumb, to go with the general view of society or whatever tends to be accurate, right? So if you hear a group of well-respected scientists say one thing, such as astrology is meaningless, then as a rule of thumb, you can generally say, I can afford not to investigate that, or I won't investigate telepathy or other things because the people that I respect say that it's rubbish. So I will take an unscientific view of their scientific explorations or their conclusions, instead of saying, as that scientist said, you're absolutely right, I don't have a right to that opinion yet. I'm going to look into it myself. Or I'll say, what? I just won't have an opinion. I'll just say, I don't have an opinion on that. And then, and then you get into the other, the astrological and the astronomical, and the combinations and the way in which those are linked in ancient societies. That then becomes more interesting, doesn't it? And the way in which what were the advanced civilizations of the Egyptians and the Mayans and other societies that we've admired over time, they had a much closer relationship between astrology and astronomy, didn't they?
Yes, because they saw all life as an organic unity. They didn't split off mineral life from human life, from planetary life. They saw the organic unity and the underlying interconnections.
Yeah, brilliant. So readers will get a lot more in that chapter as well. There's some fascinating stuff about what you describe as a Benbeen tablet of Isis, which let's not get into today, just because of there's so much in the book. So we're moving through this journey of symbolism in the perennial philosophy. And so we've looked at things like the labyrinth, tarots, and the forest, and now we're moving into man and the human body as symbolism. I just wonder if you could look at and tell us just what does the symbolism of the human body tell us over and above the so-called facts and medical data about the body.
Yeah, it tells us essentially about the human nature, the state and condition, rather than the human body, physical constitution and mechanisms. So medical science is absolutely supreme in telling us about the body, the mechanisms, but the human being who works through his body is not the same as just his body. So symbolism here has a great part to play in telling us how the human being relates to all of nature. And if you think of consciousness expressing through various vehicles, we can see how consciousness expresses through the various vehicles of the human being. as expressed through symbolism. And I've got a slide showing that as well, if you'd like to see that. So we're talking of symbolism and the human body, and why we say that man is the measure of all things. And this slide just shows the three grand centers of consciousness and power in the human body, always bearing in mind that we are a complete human being. But there are three centers: the heart center, obviously the brain, and the generative system. Superior, second, the higher center, and the lower center. Now, these have different functions, and their roles are superior. The brain has greatest physical dignity, but the generative system, even though it has the least physical dignity, it has the greatest physical importance, because it's obviously the source of power through which physical organisms are produced. The heart is, of course, the source of life. Now, this all-important brain that neuroscientists are so obsessed with, it is the link. The brain is the link by which and through which rational intelligence, life and form, in other words, spirit and matter, are united. And depending on one's nature, if one is a complete materialist, the lower center, of course, is the most active, needs no explanation. For the typical highly intellectual scientist type, it's the intellectual center, of course. But with the initiate, everything is in balance. Now, the heart, the brain, and the generative system are symbolized in all sorts of ways. You have the sun, you have the radiation from the sun, and you have the warming quality, the physical aspect of the sun. That's just one example.
The thing I think that runs steps to me here, Eddie, is so, for example, if I actually believed, if I was a materialist, if I believed in that, I would spend more time improving the physical mechanism than I do. Because one of the things that surprises me is that so-called scientists, and especially scientists in the health field, they're often unhealthy and physically unhealthy. So there's there's the predominance of knowing in an intellectual sense versus knowing in an experiential sense. So I have integrated my philosophy into my being, and you can see that. You can see that I'm healthy and vibrant, and I'm a 50 or 60-year-old guy, and I look 30, and I'm in great physical health. I'm very strong, and I can do everything that a younger person can do, because I'm actually fulfilling that source of power. And also then something else in the book that you do, you talk about neurocardiology and the primacy of the human heart, which I think is a wonderful way to utilize more skillfully the generative systems of the body in a way that lifts you up to the higher levels of consciousness. I just wondered if you could take us through that. Do you want to stop sharing the screen?
I have. Oh no, I haven't. Sorry. Yeah,
you stopped the presentation. I think.
Yeah,
there we
that's
go.
fine. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, I think neurocardiology is a wonderful blossoming dimension in medical science. Still, I would say very much in its infancy, because everything sort of you are your brain, as the saying goes. Now, there is no end of hard scientific clinical evidence that the magnetic field, the electromagnetic field, and the electrical field of the heart are several orders of magnitude greater than the equivalent ones in the brain. And there are neurons in the heart and of course neurons in the gut. And increasingly, neurocardiology is showing that problems with the heart, typically heart attacks, it's not just because you've been smoking a lot or drinking a lot or whatever. It's your emotional life. It's your feeling nature that so strongly impacts your heart. Our very language, our language puts the emphasis on the primacy of the heart. We refer to a loved one as a sweetheart, not a sweet brain. We learn music by heart. We don't learn music by brain. We say we are heartbroken. We're not brain broken. Our very language has evolved, driven by the consciousness, to show and indicate the primacy of the heart. And to use the rather simplistic analogy, I think, in the book, the brain objectifies, and as I showed in the slide, it is the link by which thought, rational intelligence are united. So the heart provides, so to speak, the invisible carrier wave. The brain makes it objective in space and time. So as the moon reflects the light of the sun, the brain, so to speak, reflects the light of consciousness from the heart. There's a wonderful saying that as a man thinks with his heart, so he is. I would love to see more research done on neurocardiology. Heart transplants provide a very good indication of the characteristic changes in personality when someone has been given a heart from someone else.
So we've been looking at the human body in that then. What exactly do you mean by the human kingdom?
Yes, that's important. Using the analogy of water, H2O. Now, H2O can express, obviously, as ice, water, and steam, all of which are visible, and superheated steam, which is invisible. We should look at the human being as a phase state of consciousness, a phase state of consciousness. So the human kingdom is the phase of consciousness that is expressing through humanity as consciousness has expressed and is expressing through the mineral, the plant, and the vegetable kingdom. That lovely poem by Rumi, that I died as a mineral and I became a plant. I died as a plant and became an animal. I died as an animal and became a human being. Where was I any less by dying? These are kingdoms of nature. They are complexes of matter, physical and non-physical, to express the indwelling consciousness.
And finally, on chapter 3, when someone exclaims, "I am God," or "I am the truth," what do they mean, Eddie?
The two diametrically opposed. When the tyrants of this world, let's not name them, explain or exclaim, I am the truth, or I am God, as they've been known to say, it is a huge outpouring of the mammoth ego. And the tyrant annihilates other people. That's obvious. The tyrant and the despot annihilates all opposition, other people. When the mystic exclaims, like Halaj, I gave the example, in the Persian market, when he explains, "I am the truth and I am God," it is an annihilation, but an annihilation of the ego. He has completely eradicated all sense of the personal self. So having merged into the universal self, he is fully entitled to exclaim, I am the truth and I am God. In the one case, it's an outer annihilation. In the second case, it's an inner annihilation. Unfortunately, it's the same words, but they mean such different things coming from different people.
Yes, brilliant. So we're moving through our symbolic journey in this work, and I think my feeling is we're getting into deeper and deeper expressions of the symbolic nature, and just reminding readers we're integrating the different levels of the human or of consciousness, and we're moving into now symbolic representations of the principle of man in chapter 4. Could you tell our listeners what exactly do you mean by the principles of man?
Right, by the principles of man, I mean man's anatomy and physiology, not medically, but his subtle anatomy and his subtle physiology. His subtle bodies, his constitution, subtle bodies, and his expression through those subtle bodies. So the examples I've used are, of course, the lotus or the rose and the inverted tree. And in the Kabbalah or the Kabbalah, however you pronounce it, the Sephirotic tree is an absolutely central teaching of Kabbalistic philosophy.
And did I see that you've got some images for us, Eddie?
Yes, definitely. I think you'll like those. So share screen. So the lotus is one of the oldest and one of the most sacred symbols used in the East, and the rose used by the Rosicrucians, of course, in the West. And what's so significant about the lotus? Well, firstly, it's got its roots in the mud, symbolizing stability in the material world. It's got its flower floating on the water, symbolizing receiving sunlight, the spiritual light. But the stalk going from the roots to the flower is equally important. It provides stability of a different kind. It provides emotional stability. So the roots provide physical stability. If the stalk were weak, then the flower would just keel over and topple. So one needs to be emotionally strong so that we can then support the flower on floating on the water. In this picture, you see how the physical body of man is symbolized by the outer petals. The subtle bodies of man, the etheric double, prana, the desire nature, the mind principle, is symbolized by the inner petals. But most importantly, the seed pod of the lotus, when all the outer petals and all fall off, we grow a new flower from the existing seed pod, which really symbolizes that everything has its origin in spirit, and evolution evolution begins from above and proceeds downwards, not the reverse as taught in Darwinian theory. So if I show you now the next slide, which is the evergreen tree. And if you remember in the podcast 1, I explained how the perennial philosophy has been likened to the evergreen tree, which always produces the same fruit, but never exactly the same type of fruit. The perennialism, the word used by Albert Schweitzer. But the tree has its roots in heaven, the perennial tree, and not on earth. Again, conveying the idea that all things have their origin in spirit, and evolution proceeds downwards. So there's been a gradual materialization of forms until there is an ultimate and fixed level of debasement. And in fact, the Egyptian pyramid also symbolizes the same idea. So the apex of the pyramid is the mystic link between heaven and earth and stands for the root of the tree in this picture, while the base of the pyramid represents the spreading branches because it extends to the four cardinal points of the universe of matter, the universe of matter. So if I move on to the Kabbalah, that's the most powerful. How did the world come into being? The great Schiller, whom Beethoven immortalized, said this, that the universe is a thought of the deity. And this ideal thought form has overflowed into actuality, and the world was born thereof, has realized the plan of its creator. And it's therefore the calling of all intelligent people to rediscover the original design. And if the universe is an outpouring of the thought of deity, so is man. And therefore man is a miniature universe. Man is a thought in the mind of deity. Now let's just look at this word, our overflow. What happens when your milk overflows? When your milk overflows, it first flows onto the hob and the kitchen table, and then onto the floor. It doesn't flow upwards. In other words, there is a descent, a movement downwards from the origin to the final point of descent. And the Kabbalah shows again that in order to create a universe, we must first have deity in repose, then deity emanating as the boundless light. Just as we go to bed at night, we repose, we awaken, and then we act. So in our case, it's repose, sleep, awakening, and action, repose emanating in the boundless light. In the Kabbalah, the macrocosm is stratified, so to speak, into the unmanifest worlds and the manifest worlds, the world, formless world of spirit, and then all the manifest worlds, which start with the archetype, the creative, the substantial, and the material, physical. Man is a miniature universe, so we are made in exactly the same way. Atma, the spiritual soul, corresponding to the world of divine names. Manas, the human soul, corresponding to the archangels and the world of creations. The terrestrial, corresponding, of course, to the physical material. And the tree of life knits all this together, showing the correspondences between the various organs and functions of the human body and the human being. These spheres are called sephiroth, in other words, globes or spheres of influence pertaining to the context and the plane on which they are. So Malkuth is the last sephiroth pertaining to the human kingdom, and obviously therefore must correspond to the 2 feet.
Wow.
I think we'll stop sharing there.
Fantastic.
And I won't rub. Sorry, go on.
The thing that stands out for me there, using that diagram, Eddie, is the hermetic axiom and as above, so below.
Yeah.
And I know, I mean, you place a great deal of emphasis on the axiom and the related issues of analogy and correspondence. First of all, so why do you think that is? And then, given what you perceive to be the importance of it, what attention do you see establishment science giving or not giving to the hermetic axiom?
I really don't believe, Jonathan, that science gives it any attention consciously. They obviously do in a, well, not, I wouldn't say unconsciously, Science, of course, looks to nature to try and understand problems and solve problems. I believe the man who discovered, Velcro, the Velcro tape, got the idea from seeing how insects with their curled up legs can stick to branches and leaves and that kind of thing. But I don't think science looks to the heavens, so to speak, in order to understand problems on Earth, because looking to the heavens requires a certain degree of reverence. And that's a quality that I'm afraid is rather sadly lacking in science and scientists.
And Eddie, on that, you just remind me of so my background, obviously, as people may know by now, is economics.
Yes.
And the thing that for me it's an inhuman or a non-human science, or it isn't a philosophy the way that it's described today as one belonging to nature, when actually economics is linked to ecology, right? Because
should be, yeah.
The first principle of economics as it's currently taught is scarcity. And yet a mere glance at nature will tell you that, and as a gardener, your problem as a gardener, if you're any good, is one of abundance. And that's why I love the phrase that you described there of overflowing.
Overflowing.
Because that is the nature of nature, is to overflow, isn't it? Is to fill. I mean, whether you say nature abhors a vacuum, but just in the most positive sense, is once you create the environment for natural things to express themselves or to grow or to become what is in them, then your problem is one of abundance, of having too many plants, of having too many fruits, too many apples, that we were feeding a school of people with all the apples on our 2 trees because there were just so many of them. And it is that absence of abundance that's the key. And so they're not looking to say, well, if we are not representing as above, so below, if our science is not in essence the same as what we see around us, then our science must be wrong because we're not expressing the deeper or the greater truth.
Or impoverish you. You've struck a very, very important note there, Jonathan. Overflow. It is really an outpouring of love. And it's not being sentimental at all to say that the whole act of creation or emanation is an act of love, because if you love someone, you express, there is an outpouring from you. If you love gardening, you express through your flowers and your trees. If you love music, you express. There has to be an outpouring from within. And that outpouring is of the nature of love, if you like to call it that. So that's a very important point you made. And talking about the hermetic axiom, the great Newton worked entirely in accordance with these principles of as above, so below. If I quote, that which is below is like that which is above, and that which is above is like that which is below, to do the miracles of the only thing, the miracles of the only thing. So here is a very meaningful slide on showing the hermetic axiom and Newton's translation of it. Now, I put this to you, Jonathan. How many scientists would have the humility to read this word-for-word translation by Newton of the hermetic axiom? What we see is a reflection of the divine in our material world. And the quote by Newton I read out was this, but there's so much more.
And what is that a translation of? When it says a translation by Isaac Newton found among his alchemic...
Oh, it's a translation of the Emerald Tablet of Hermes Trismegistus.
Right.
And I've given other translations as well in volume 1. It's...
I must find it. I do find it. I mean, it's kind of funny. It's not funny in the effect that it's had, but the way in which scientists will take insights from a great scientist, and then for anything that doesn't match their view of the world, they ignore it, and they say, "Oh, it's like Isaac Newton must have had a bad day when he was getting into these as above, so the hermetic axiom. Let's ignore that." And like with Alfred Wallace, he made some great insights at the same time as Darwin, but let's forget his focus on spirituality at the end of his life that he said was more important. Well, they won't focus on that, and the idea that Newton was doing those things, and that was the foundation of his philosophy, and it wasn't in spite of, it was because of he had those insights, that he had what we describe as the scientific insights, because the deeper truth allowed him to surface the truths in nature that we see today, right?
Yes, scientists will arbitrarily use Occam's razor, or as someone once put it, Occam's hatchet, to slice off whatever does not suit their materialistic convenience.
Yeah, it's just and then we move into the area that some of the areas I focus on, which is the whole round neuroscience and psychedelic research and stuff, and the complexity they create to avoid the acceptance of a higher level of consciousness, and the transcendence of the ego and what that actually means. Just unnecessary. It's a reversal of Occam's razor, isn't it? Unfortunately,
it is. Yes, it is a back to front thing. Yeah.
So on this, in the chapter, we're talking in the law of analogy. You talk about analogy and correspondence, and on the diagram that you showed, there was a petal of things like analogy, correlation, connection, relationship, correspondence, and harmony. And then we move into the divine mandate. And maybe could you tell us a bit about the divine mandate?
Yes, in mathematics we're taught algebra, and what is algebra? It is a statement of universals, or a statement of the general that applies in a particular field of context. So the simplest algebraic formula is distance equals speed times time. So any speed multiplied by any time will give you the distance wherever you are, on Earth or on the Moon or on Mars. So the divine mandate is, in the sense, a statement of universals as the emanating source of the vast scheme of evolution, which is represented by the series. So just as you can unpack an algebraic formula and produce a whole load of numbers coming out of it as the series, but if you don't know the formula, you won't know the series. So in the same sense, the divine mandate is a statement of universals, which is why the perennial philosophy, in one sense, has been referred to as an algebraic exposition of truth, because it's a statement of universals.
Wow. And so it's actually, so what you've just describing there is when someone talks about that, it's actually the elevation, because I was actually imagining that the world comes down to the level of mathematics, but actually the world is being expressed at a higher level through mathematics. Is that right? Because we're talking about universals.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Universals with a relative, because it is within its field of application.
Yeah.
Or generalities, I should say. Yeah.
I just wonder if we move now to chapter 6, and it's like you describe, it's cosmogenesis, the unfolding of consciousness, and you have cosmic planes with a capital K, to terrestrial planes, and you make a distinction between cosmic spelt with a K and cosmic spelt with a C.
Yes, the distinction is a subtle and important one. Cosmic with a C refers really to our own solar system and our own solar scheme. cosmic with a K refers to all solar systems and all galaxies. Now, if that sounds highly boastful, again, one invokes the hermetic axiom to show that our solar scheme is not unique and separate from everything else. It's an unfolding of the whole scheme of the universe. And cosmic with a K is the closest one gets to the scientific idea of the multiverse, which is one of the latest theories in science about our universe.
And what we're going in, just to keep our listeners with us, is we're now moving, so we've been moving through symbols and the language of the mystery teachings. We're moving into the hermetic axiom, as above, so below, which is a reference to why symbols can be so useful for us if we hold them lightly. And now you've got into cosmogenesis, which is the unfolding of consciousness from a higher plane to a lower plane. And so
the
in
unfolding
a sense,
of cosmos, yeah.
Yes.
Right.
And so could you just go into just what you mean by cosmogenesis? Because I know some listeners, and I certainly wasn't, may not be entirely clear on what that is, and cosmogenesis and cosmic planes.
Well, cosmogenesis is the origin and birth of cosmos. Cosmogony is the study of the origin and genesis of cosmos. It's splitting hairs a bit. Cosmic planes, I mean, different levels of the cosmos in exactly the same way as the human being has different levels of consciousness. He has the physical, the astral, the mental, and the spiritual. Likewise, if you just recall the Kabbalah diagram I showed you, there were the unmanifest and there were the manifest planes. So cosmic planes refers to centers of force and consciousness at different levels. And those different universes have their own constants, as science is slowly coming to realize. So the multiverse idea has really developed from recent ideas in cosmology and particle physics, and led to the remarkable realization that our universe, rather than being unique, could be one of many universes, which is exactly what the ancient philosophies always said. So together as a totality, all these universes contain everything that exists, the entirety of space, time, matter, energy, and the laws and constants that govern them. And Stephen Hawking with Herzog, I think, only a month before he died, he wrote a paper showing mathematically about the multiverse. And providing mathematical evidence, so to speak, of the multiverse.
Yes, it is the most remarkable thing that, as someone raised in a Western society, where anything outside of our society can't have been intelligent because we're the pinnacle of it. And if you do say something intelligent from another culture, then it was because you got lucky. And you found, and so the idea that the ancient texts from literally thousands of years ago are now being proven, in inverted commas, by modern science, the cutting edge science. I just wonder, there must be some, ancient hermit sat on a hill somewhere, just quietly nodding their head, going, "Well, I told you," or "We told you."
Yes. We told you, and we saw it coming.
Yes, and it was present. I guess that again, it brings us back to the importance of our senses and perception, because if ancient cultures found this out themselves without the scientific insights or the tools that we have today, then it had to be through better use of their senses and their ability to comprehend what they were sensing
and seeing. Yes. Yes.
are you sensing in the way of using all the senses? So yes, to seeing, and also and the whole experience of it. I know it's something that's becoming more mainstream now is the Akasha and astral light and the
Right.
Akashic field. In simple terms, Eddie, what is Akasha and what's astral light?
Right. In simple terms, words like Akasha, words like primordial root matter have been used in a variety of ways. Newton used the Latin word prima materia. And I've got a quick slide to show you on that. So all of these terms can convey the essential meaning of world substance, of essential nature. And the finest definition of Akasha comes from one of the greatest modern scientists, Irving Laszlo. And if I just read his definition of Akasha, which is as good as any, he says, Akasha, the Sanskrit word meaning ether, all-pervasive space, radiation or brilliance. In Indian philosophy, Akasha was considered the first and most fundamental of the 5 elements. It is the womb from which everything we perceive with our senses has emerged, and into which everything will ultimately redescend. So the Akashic record is also called the Akashic Chronicle, is the enduring record of all that happens and has ever happened in the whole of the universe. So the astral light is the lowest, the dregs of the Akashic field, like the lining, the coarsest lining of your coat. And if I quickly show you Newton's own diagram of prima materia, just to make the point that these great scientists really knew what they were talking about. Right, can you see that, Jonathan?
Yeah.
Right, you can see this?
Yeah.
If you look, I've underlined it in red. This is Newton's representation of primordial substance. Have a good look at the astrological symbols. Here's Saturn, prima materia, the original substance.
So what is he showing in that diagram then?
What he's showing in that diagram is how everything that has emanated, he refers to the rays, if you can see it, the rays from the central star, 4 lines above. I'm trying to get my mouse to point to it. He's showing how from the center, from the central point, the prima materia, everything else has emanated. All the other elements are subsumed in this central womb.
So we read the diagram then from the center. In the center, it says prima materia, and from that, all the other.
Yeah.
And there's 7. Are they elements that?
Well, I would say 7 worlds.
7 worlds, right?
Yeah.
Wow.
So if I quickly, cheekily go to a previous slide, we were talking again of the human body in symbolism, and the veena is a beautiful Indian instrument which is built according to the structure of the human spine, as you can see in the diagram to the left.
And was the intention to create the human body, or in a symbol of the human body, or is it?
It's a celebration of the human being, and also to show that the human being is in the nature of a divine musical instrument, because as a musical instrument has the apex and the foundation, and the strings are between the apex and the foundation, so the human being is strung like a musical instrument between Atma and the physical body. So I'll come out of this.
So Eddie, I think what might be a good idea is if we just pause this conversation here. We were hoping to do it in one go. And I think we've just there's so much in volume 3. So I hope the listeners are really getting the value of this. And what we'll do is we'll pause now and let's restart again. And we'll take then to the end of the book, because we're coming up to halfway on my questions. And then we can just have it in a digestible format for the listeners. So for the time being, thanks very much, Eddie, and we'll see you very, very soon. Thank you for watching this video. To explore these ideas further, be sure to visit Shepheard-Walwyn.com and join our mailing list for news and special offers. Check out our authors and buy the books to learn more. And you can also find us on social media. Links are in the description box. So please like the video and subscribe to our YouTube channel. It's surprisingly helpful in getting our ideas out. So until next time, keep reading